So with that, we'll get started with today's webinar. I want to say hello to everyone out there who's joining us today. My name is Abby Bauer, and I'm an associate editor here at Horde's Dairyman magazine. I would like to welcome you to this webinar, which is brought to you by Horde's Dairyman and the University of Illinois. It takes a team for us to produce these webinars, and I definitely appreciate the work that our webinar producer, Jim Baltz at the University of Illinois, and our Horde's Dairyman online media manager, Patty Hirchin, do behind the scenes to put these events together. My co-host for today is the well-known and respected Mike Hutchins from the University of Illinois, and together we have the pleasure of welcoming another pair of presenters for this webinar. Today we will have Phil Durst and Stan Moore from Michigan State University Extension with us to give a presentation titled Milking Evaluation Reveals Costly Problems. Milking can become pretty routine on many dairy farms as it happens multiple times a day, every day, and sometimes not a lot of thought is being put into the actual process. However, the data collected by their extension team in Michigan revealed some common problems that I think we can all learn from and become better at the milk harvesting process. So I look forward to hearing what Phil and Stan have to share with us today. Mike, if you would go ahead and further introduce both gentlemen, and then we can start this month's webinar.
Well, very good, Abby. It's my honor and pleasure to introduce our doubleheader. We have two presenters here today. First is Stan Moore, who is a Michigan State Extension dairy educator located in Belvidere, Michigan, and he works primarily in the Northwest Lower Peninsula and the Upper Peninsula as well. Stan has worked some 28 years with the Michigan State Extension Service here, and in 2017 he led the Michigan State Dairy Team's farm where they assessed milk recording on farms to evaluate overmilking and biphasic milking on Michigan farms. The other co-worker that will be sharing the microphone with Stan today is Phil Durst. He is also a field-based educator at Michigan State University, working with Extension statewide in the areas of dairy and beef cattle health and production. He's a senior one, at least as far as servers, over 30 years experience in Extension work, and started out with his career at Penn State University and subsequently went to Michigan State University. Phil was born in Maryland and got his master's degree at Penn State University. And so without any further ado, we won't say too many more things about the basketball tournament at this point, but Michigan was in the Final Four, and we all watched them on Saturday night. Gentlemen, we'll turn the microphone over to you and let you cover the information today on milking equipment.
Well, good day, everybody. We're glad to be with you. This is Phil Durst.
This is Stan Moore.
And we've titled this Milking Evaluation Reveals Costly Problems. And the reality is the problems are there. They're not revealed until we evaluate the milking. And I think that's a key point, that these are problems that are ongoing. And so as we talk about where we're at, that's us. Yep. All right. As we talk about where we're at today, we have to recognize the changes that have been taking place in the dairy industry. On many farms, employees are doing much of the milking. But even on farms where owners are still involved in milking, employees are often there. And frankly, on some of the large farms, shifts go around the clock. We have got farms that shut down only to clean the system and keep that parlor going. There's a pressure certainly then to get cows through. When you're working around the clock, we've got to get cows through. The throughput is certainly important. And even though we emphasize protocols to our employees and we talk about them, we train in them, the question is, how well are they being followed? So evaluation of milking can provide valuable feedback, both for the employees and for management. And we think that really the outcome of this is a terrific training tool and an aha moment for a lot of farms to say, oh, there's something going on that I didn't even recognize, and we can correct that.
So what we want to do today is share some research that we did both through Michigan State University, Vet College, USDA grant that we were involved with Dr. Ron Erskine. It was really a 3-state multi-year grant on Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Florida, looking at all types and sizes of parlors and really evaluating what was happening out there with the milking. And then we followed that up with some research on Michigan farms as well through an MSU extension project in 2017, where we looked at 26 different farms. Those farms hosted about 19,000 cows, and we evaluated about just under 1,000 of those cows through our research project. And what we want to share from this today is what we learned from those research projects, how that could impact your cows and your farm, and then what you can do about that. So to do that research, in all cases, we used a new technology, fairly new technology called Vaidya units. And these are vacuum diagnostic recorders by a company called Biocontrol. We really like these because they're pretty lightweight, battery operated units. We could strap right to the milking claw and basically kept it, mostly out of the way of the milkers. Really didn't see any negative consequences of milking with these units on for the milkers as they were in the parlor. We taped them to the unit, as I said, on it, not really interfering. And then they had multiple connection points. So what we were measuring is the vacuum at the front and rear mouthpiece. Thank you, mouthpiece, and also then at the short milk tube. And then they did have a pulsator tube as well. We could measure pulsation measurements with these, although we didn't use that in our particular research that we're going to talk about today.
So we would put these on at the beginning of milking, or before the beginning of milking. Then the milkers would take over and do their shift without doing anything with these units. And then at the end of the shift, generally, we would take the units off and have the data downloaded.
Right. And so then afterwards, we get back to the office, we can go ahead and download that data on our laptops and figure out exactly what was happening with those cows. And then we would give that report then back to the producer to make changes on their farm. So again, they're measuring really what's happening with that cow. What we're trying to measure is the experience to the cow, or as Dr. Erskine would say, we're letting the cows vote on their experience. And we think that's really valuable to being able to see, as Phil said, what's going on in the parlor that we may not readily recognize. So it's giving the cows a vote. It enables us to analyze the milking of all cows milked at those stalls for the entire milking. So again, very, very easy to stand back and pay attention then to what's going on with procedure. We can evaluate procedure. We can take films of the milkers performing those procedures so that we can then give better feedback to the producer. Well, you might say, why is this really a problem? I mean, in Michigan, we're a leading state for milk quality. Through our cooperatives, through extension, we've done a number of programs that have really put an emphasis on proper milking protocols and following those protocols. And the result has been, some pretty good somatic cell counts, good parlor throughput. And a lot of farms then may say, why should I care? I'm doing pretty good out here. And but we really wanted to see, could they do better? And what are the cows actually experiencing?
And is there an impact of problems on the cow? And I think that's a critical thing, because we found that there, in fact, are impacts not only on the cow, but on the farm from problems in milking time.
So I think it'd be good to step back and take a look at, what are we really trying to accomplish in the parlor? What are our recommendations? And so for that parlor routine, we'd like to see 10 to 15 seconds of physical stimulation of the teats of the cows. And we'd like that to be early on in the process. So when we were out looking at farms, we had some farms that accomplished 10 to 15 seconds of stimulation, but it might be just before the milker went on. That's not really what we want to see. We want to see it early on in that process. From the time that first stimulation starts until the milker is put on, we want a lag time of 60 to 120 seconds. And then we want those milking units to come off with approximately 1/2 to 1 cup of milk still in the udder. So we're not anxious to get every last drop out of this cow. Don't want to leave tons behind either. And it's the parlor routine that accomplishes that if we do it consistently across each cow. Well, what's normal? The normal process is that we stimulate that cow through cleaning of the teats, through stripping the teats, through rubbing the teat ends, getting that that sanitizer, the teat dip mixed in well to clean those teats. That's going to then send in a really simplified way, a signal to the brain into the cow's pituitary gland to release oxytocin, and that travels to the blood, in the blood to the udder. When the cells in the udder get that signal, they release their milk. And that's really the time that we want to get that unit attached, is about that time that the milk is being released. So here's just another diagram of that Vaidya unit. So we've got in a relative normal output from the Vaidya units, they're in your bottom right-hand corner. And so channel 1 represents the rear teat mouthpiece chamber. And so what's happening with vacuum right there at that chamber, and that's in red, right? And then so at the bottom of the graph there, you can also see the red lines. And then your blue is your mouthpiece chamber front teat, okay? And then the green up at the top here of that red graph is your short milk tube. And so that's connected as relatively close to the cluster. That's going to give us an idea of how much milk is going through that tube. And so what we're looking for in a normal cow is we would like that rear and front teat end vacuum to go down relatively quickly. So it should drop right away. That means that milk is being released. And so what we're measuring again here is we're measuring inches of mercury. So it's a vacuum that we're measuring. And what that is inversely related to what's happening with milk flow. So as that vacuum drops down in those teat end measurements, that also means that the milk flow has started. So we'd like those to drop down below 4 inches of mercury right away and stay there until she's ready to, when she's completed milking.
And you can see in this case that the rear teat, that's the blue one, the blue graph, has milked out first.
Right.
And so in this case, the vacuum goes up because the milk flow goes down. Milk flow has simply stopped. The vacuum goes back up. And then approximately in this case, 45 seconds later, the rear teat is done. And so the rear quarter is done. And so again, the vacuum goes up as the milk flow goes down.
Yep. You'll also notice here at the top, so this is your short milk tube, this green. And what we would expect here is as the cow is milking, we're going to see a lot of noise up and down in that. And as you'll notice when she starts finishing her milking, okay, the front teat vacuum's coming up, rear teat vacuum's coming up, that noise becomes much less, not really a straight line, but, heading that direction. So that's normal. And, milking routines, we expect to be normal. And if we've got a good routine and it's being followed consistently, we'd expect a higher percentage of cows to have a normal milking experience. But in reality, what we've experienced both through this research project and just in our visits out to farms is that it's not always routine. Things happen. And so we have things like employee turnover. So we've got new employees coming in, trying to learn the protocol. When they're in there, of course, the senior milkers are having to teach the protocol. And so everything changes a bit as you're going through that experience. If there's pressure in the parlor to get more cows through, something happens to really create a scenario where, hey, we got to get things moving in here. It's pretty easy to move into a situation where we might take some shortcuts in the parlor. Maybe somebody doesn't show up for work, and how are we going to get this all done? Certainly management issues. Have they received proper training? Are they getting the feedback that would encourage them to continue to do this proper milking routine? We know that employees may have a lack of understanding about what's actually required to stimulate cows and get that good parlor throughput. And then finally, there is equipment problems, and we experience those on farms as well.
So the first problem that we identified on a number of is a problem we call biphasic milking. Some people call it bimodal milking, but we're going to refer to it as biphasic because there's really a couple different phases to that start of milking. And it results when the oxytocin that comes from the pituitary has not yet reached the mammary cells. And so if it hasn't reached cells, and they're not ready to express that milk. The unit may be on, but the milk is still in those cells. It stops. It starts, and then it stops until the cells release the milk. And that period of stoppage may be 30 to 120 seconds long. We also can call that delayed milk ejection. So again, it's delay in reaching the full flow of milk. So biphasic milking. Now, we have a poll question for you. I'm going to turn over to Dr. Hutchins, who will ask you a poll question.
The question is, what percent of the herd would you predict has greater than 30% of the cows with biphasic milking? Boy, this is a tough question. The one basically is 0 to 20, second choice 21 to 40, third choice 41 to 60%, 61 to 80%, and then of course last choice is over 81%. Wow, Abby, this looks like a really tough question, and votes are coming in slow, as we would say at this point. Abby, do you want to vote?
Yeah, I feel like this is a tough one. Just going to completely guess. I'm going to pick that 21 to 40% of the herds. What do you think, Mike?
Wow, this is really weird. I had 30% of the cows with biphasic, over 30% of the cows. I'm going to go right in the middle because who knows, if in doubt, go in the middle, that's the old Army theory. So I'll take 41 to 60%. So we've got about almost at 60% here, gentlemen, and it's all over, as we would say. So Jim, let's go ahead and close the poll and share those results. And Stan and Phil, who wants to discuss the results?
Well, so we've got a pretty good breakdown here with the majority saying 21 to 40%, and then a good portion saying going right down the middle of Mike at 41 to 60, and the others on the edges at 0 to 20 or 60 to 80%. Well, that's a really good guessing because frankly, it is guessing. And remember what we're talking about here is more than 30% of the cows in a herd having biphasic milking. Obviously, we're not just talking about the presence of biphasic milking. We're really talking a high standard, and that is over 30% of the cows in the herd with biphasic milking. So let's show you the results from our Michigan studies. And I think I'm back here online, and that's the poll question. And now we have our results. So in research by Dr. Erskine, 34% of the herds, that was 22 out of 64, experienced biphasic milking in over 30% of the cows. When we did this as an extension project, we also experienced about the similar percentage. That's amazing to us that a third of the herds have a third of their cows. Okay, a third herds, a third of cows being biphasic milked. All right, let's talk about the implications of that and what that means. So let's first of all take a look at the Vaidya graph that shows that really well. Stan had showed you the normal cow being milked out, and again we have a very similar situation here. The blue line is the front quarter. The red line is the rear quarter. You can see in this case that milk flow started immediately as the vacuum dropped from around 13.5 inches of mercury down to around 3 inches of mercury right away. And as milk came out of the teat cistern, out of the gland cistern, milk flow started. And you can see it started from maybe, I'm not looking real closely, but maybe about 15 seconds. And then vacuum went back up. Well, if vacuum went back up, because vacuum and flow are inversely related, then we know that milk flow essentially stopped, or it slowed down considerably. So those the cows in this case, the cow that had this graph, she was not stimulated to the point where oxytocin had reached the cells to let out the milk, to express the milk. Now, in this case, you can see that's 60 to 90 seconds. I'll say closer to 90 seconds until she reaches full flow again as the vacuum drop, meaning that the milk flow goes back up. So for a period of time, although the unit was on and was working,
yeah, I think
get the sound effect,
right.
that no milk was coming out of that cow. And then you can see that she milks out, and then the milk out occurs. So biphasic milking is where we have the start of milk flow, stoppage of milk flow, stop for a while, and then restart.
So here's a good graph of what's normal out there, and you can see the dispersal. So it's important to talk about averages, but it's also important to talk about what are we seeing out there as a percentage of biphasic in the herd.
So on the left, on the axis that's vertical axis, that's it. It's a number of herds, and in this case, remember there were 64 herds involved, and then the percent of cows or biphasic in the herd is on the horizontal axis. Well, you can see if we go start with clear to the right that there was a herd that had over 70% of the cows biphasic. But frankly, there was a third of the herds in which over 50% of the cows were biphasic. There was about a third of the herds that were in the middle of 20 to 50%. And then, again, there was it was 34% that were 30% or greater. But look at the first bar, less than or equal to 10% of cows are biphasic. We know that there's going to be cows that are just for some reason, it's going to happen that they'll be milk biphasic. But when we can reduce that and keep that below 10% or 10% or below, we feel that that's normal. In fact, it was achieved in this case by a third of the herds, right? By 22 out of 64 herds achieved a rate of biphasic milking of less than or equal to 10%. So that's what we believe is achievable on every farm. The case where that wasn't happening was because of problems in the milking procedure that we'll talk about. Now, an interesting observation here, as we looked at the data and as we looked at the films that we took in the parlor and timed those, and the data, of course, is charted on a graph with time, is that milking time, total milking time, did not increase with delayed milk injection. Well, you'd say, well, that seems counterintuitive. Why would it not? In fact, if we delayed full flow of milk, then shouldn't that delay just go on the end of milking or extend milking by that length of time? Well, that was not the case. It did not increase the total milking time. Well, then you say, well, why worry about it? Well, here are some impacts of what that biphasic milking is on the cow. Immediately, there are some impacts on the cow. First of all, it makes the cow uncomfortable when the vacuum is going on that milker while she's milking, but no milk is coming out. And that uncomfortable cow is something that we don't want. But beyond that, there's changes happening in the teat itself, because you can't apply vacuum to a teat with nothing coming out without impacts on the animal herself, without impact on the teat. And so there's congestion occurring in the teat during that vacuum without milk flow. That congestion is going to narrow the street canal and making it more difficult for milk to come out, in fact. Right. And here's an important point. Subsequent research has shown reduced milk from those cows. We're going to talk about that more in just a minute. But first of all, also remember that those are just immediate impacts of biphasic milkings. We have to say there's also eventual impacts. That is, impacts that occur when this continues for a long period of time. And that is changes in the teat itself and increased teat end roughness, which make it much more difficult to clean that teat end and to keep the cow from getting mastitis. So these are important impacts of biphasic milking, but let's explore further this reduced production. So in this case, Dr. Erskine in a project measured the production of cows without delayed milk ejection or without biphasic milking versus those with delayed milk injection on one farm. So that eliminated a lot of the variability that could take place. In fact, it was a farm that had a separate pen, separate parlor for fresh cows. So they were excluded from this. It was all Holsteins. It was four pens, and that were managed similarly. So again, to try to reduce the variability, and then that milking was analyzed with the Vaidya units. Any treated or clinical mastitis cows were eliminated from this. 3/4 cows were eliminated. If the unit was kicked off or fell off, those cows were eliminated, and it was the first milking shift of the day. So again, and by the way, in this case, on this farm, that mattered. So because they were the better milkers. So in order to find out what the impact was in milk production, if there was a difference between those cows that had delayed milk and those cows that did not have delayed milk. Well, here's the results. In time to milk letdown, and again, this is to full letdown rather than just the initial letdown coming out of the teat cistern. Right? When that was less than 30 seconds, we called that normal. Okay, and there was no change in milk yield there. That's our baseline. Okay, but when the time to milk letdown was 30 seconds to a minute, cows gave 3.5 pounds less milk. When that delay was a minute or longer, 60 seconds or longer, there was 6.5 to 7 pounds of lost milk at that milking. Oh, that's incredible. That's telling us that when in fact the biphasic milking or the delayed milk injection did not increase the milking time,
Right.
that cows responded by giving less milk. They let down less milk until that milker came off.
Right. They didn't milk faster. The milker unit came off in the same amount of time. And so by definition, then they had to give less milk, and they did.
So biphasic milking again occurs when the unit is attached before letdown occurs. Now, letdown is affected by udder fill, and therefore the frequency of milking comes into play, the production of the cow comes into play, the stage of lactation comes into play. Certainly, these are all factors that come into play when we talk about what it is to take to get that cow to let down milk. But given the same protocol, some cows may have biphasic milking and other cows not. And the cows which did not don't suffer milk loss. But those that do have biphasic, they suffer the milk loss. So obviously we would need a protocol that reduces the number of cows that are going to have biphasic letdown or biphasic milking. Subsequent research by Erskine showed that over a 10-day period, that some cows may have delayed milk ejection or biphasic milking 100% of their milkings. Right? That is that every single time they go in the parlor, it's a biphasic milking, and they'll lose 10 pounds of milk a day. But remember that the previous chart I showed you was the loss per milking.
Right.
So at greater than 60 seconds, over 6 pounds of lost milk per that milking. Let's just say it's 10 pounds a day lost. That's a significant amount of loss. And those that are biphasic 50% of the time will therefore lose 5 pounds of milk per day. These are significant losses that we just can't ignore. And the question is, why do we have these losses and what can be done about it? Well, when they correlated the percentage of biphasic milking, they say it happens more often with larger herds. More often when there's longer milking shifts. More often when there's more visits to the cow in the protocol that they have. And certainly more often when there's less lag time from the stimulation to the attachment of the unit. That's an important distinction because we have to have that stimulation to the attachment of the unit. So here is some data in which it's kind of funny when we talk about a distinction between small herds and large herds, because even in Michigan, we have large herds that are much larger than 300 cows, but we made a cut at 300 cows and said, what's the impact of farm size on stimulation time? And with small herds that is under 300 cows, the shift length is obviously shorter. There's fewer units per operator than with larger herds. That's no question about it. The milk latency period or the lag time, frankly, is acceptable in both cases. It's a little shorter in the larger herds, but they're both acceptable at, we said it should be 60 to 120 seconds, and so they're right in that ballpark, okay? But look at what happened to stimulation time. A big difference here in stimulation time from 19.2 seconds to 8.8 seconds in herds over 300 cows. And that's not because of necessarily a protocol change. That's because of what's happening in the herd, in the parlor, on larger herds. There's a greater pressure to move these cows through and to get what we think is going to result in greater throughput. The problem is it doesn't result in greater throughput.
And the other thing, Phil, when I see those low numbers on that large herd for the stimulation time for that average, when I see it getting below what we'd recommend, I also start worrying about when is that stimulation taking place?
Yeah.
Because now there's a real opportunity that she didn't get very much stimulation in that first step.
Right, because if we talk about milk latency period or the lag time being from first touch to unit attachment, the reality is it doesn't occur until we get sufficient stimulation. So stimulation can be provided by brushing the teats to remove sand and dirt. We have farms that do that. They'll hand brush, or they'll use a mechanical brush to brush the teats. Fore stripping is a great stimulation step, and then obviously drying. However, stimulation, as we've been saying, needs to be concentrated and front-loaded. That is, that lag time starts when the animal is sufficiently stimulated. Therefore, drying the teat and attaching the unit in the same pass or the same visit to the cow does not provide that time. When we go through on a visit to the cow, dry and attach, that stimulation, which its stimulation is inadequate. It's adequate to start the process, but the lag time then is inadequate. So why does that occur? Well, sometimes it is the protocol. But before changing the protocol, we need to make sure it is a protocol and not the adherence to the protocol. So we need to evaluate what's happening in the parlors. And whether it's done by cameras, whether it's done by going in there in person, we need to time how long stimulation takes. We need to time what the lag time is. We need to figure out whether or not the protocol is allowing for the lag times to be there. If it's adherence to the protocol, and sometimes that occurs on different shifts. I did milking evaluation on 3 shifts of a farm and found out that milking varied on each of the 3 shifts from the previous shift. It was amazing. And yet that's not how they trained them. And so we need to look at what happens at nighttime, what happens on weekends. And again, training is about making sure everybody knows what's right to do. Everybody knows the right protocols. And so if adherence is the problem, then we need to go back to our training and make sure people understand that. But if there's deviation from the protocol, even when they've been trained, and sometimes that occurs because there's a missing person in the parlor, they're fetching cows, they're doing the laundry, that is the towels for milking, they're taking a bathroom break. Those things impact timing of letdown, the timing of lag time and the stimulation time. Maybe it's extra persons in the parlor. We've seen that as people come in to, quote, help out, and that just throws the timing of everything off. So we need to understand why we're getting differences in what our timing should be in the parlor. Okay. Now, if in fact we don't get enough stimulation time, then we need to concentrate on how can we increase stimulation time early in the protocol to the cow. For example, if we're only getting 5 to 6 seconds per cow, and we said that normal was 10 to 15 seconds per cow, that's what we need, 10 to 15. You can see that we're short by quite a bit here. How can we increase that? Well, obviously, we can increase that more like by doubling it, right. By going through again a second time around the 4 teats, or by doubling the time on each teat. We need to do things to increase that stimulation time. Fore stripping, which many herds have dropped, is a great stimulation step, right, and also has other benefits as well. And the investment that you make in that is not going to cost extra time in the parlor. That we fully believe that as we increase the stimulation time, that investment in time will improve milk production. If we've got cows that have been biphasically milked, it's going to increase milk production, and it's going to improve teat health. But in order to do that, it's going to take a change from the top to the bottom. Everybody from the owner down to the milker hired yesterday has to know that we need to stimulate these teats. It has to take a change in the attitude in the parlor and a conscious effort to do that, because it's all a matter of routine. And as milkers do these things in a short period of time, they've got to learn to slow down on the stimulation and understand that that's going to be paid back in the end.
Dr. Erskine, and we certainly believe this as well, really promoting a change in the way we look at parlors and stop talking so much about parlor throughput and a lot more about parlor efficiency and how much milk are we getting out of that parlor per hour versus how many turns we can get per hour. And as we start to look at these concepts of improving stimulation and improving the milking experience for the cow, we really believe you can increase your parlor efficiency. Well, Phil's done a great job of talking about the first issue that we saw out there, which was biphasic milking and the issues that can cause. We do also want to talk about a second problem that we saw, which was an overmilking. And we defined overmilking as when a unit stays on a cow more than 30 seconds after the milking is complete. So she's done milking and the unit's staying on. I'm not going to try to repeat your sucking sound, Phil, but definitely some vacuum on those teats. Phil did a great job of explaining that, in the long run, that's going to cause changes to that teat, a thickening in the cell wall. She's going to milk out even slower in the future because of that.
Well, it looks like we have another poll question coming up here, so get ready to vote here. You guys can take a quick drink of water if you wish. Oh boy, Abby, here we go again. What percent of the herds would you predict had 30% of the cows being overmilked? And again, we have the same 5 categories. I will not read those to you, but you can select if you wish, and we're off and running. And we got some very quick voters here that are coming in very quickly, and it must be the Democrats, I think, are coming in quicker now because we insulted them as far as that goes. Abby, which one are you going to select this time?
Mike, I think I'm going to go with the same 21 to 40%, about 30%, a third of the herds milking more than a third of their cows too long.
Yeah, my problem is that if I pick your number, then I can't gain on you, and you're ahead of me by 1 vote already. And so I guess I'm going to stay with the middle again, but it's just a guess. I really don't know if it's that or I'm going to go really low. I would go really low. It would be 2 guess, but you may have the right answer there as far as that goes. So we've got almost 60% of the vote in, and Jim, let's go ahead and close the poll, and we'll let Stan and Phil decide what do they see on the outcome.
Yeah, so similar votes to last time, and interesting spread there. And certainly we've seen, as we looked at the herds, a variation in the number of herds that had overmilking as well. So I'm going to take us back to the PowerPoint. Okay. And we'll click on it here. All right, and the answer is actually 2 answers. So in our larger experiment, Dr. Hutchins, you got the answer right. About 44% of the herds experienced.
And it pains us to say that you were right.
It really pains us to say that. But you
Well,
were right. And unfortunately, in our dairy team's 2017 summer research project, we actually saw 84% of herds had over 30% of cows overmilked by 30 seconds using the exact same technology. So much smaller data set, obviously, or a smaller data set, I should say, but saw a large amount of overmilking happening. So let's talk about why. Well, first of all, let's talk about what it is and what it looks like on the Vaidya graph. So in this case, you can see this cow, actually she had a great stimulation lag time because she came right in, and boy, she's giving milk, and milk is flowing. Those rear and front teat ends, vacuum goes right down to below 4, hovers along that, and about 3 minutes in, she's done milking. And that vacuum starts increasing first in the front and then in the rear. It's kind of the normal occurrence, but not always. You also see that noise in the green line slowing down and becoming more consistent. But look how long this unit was on her. A good minute and a half that this unit's on her after the Vaidya is telling us she's done.
When a cow is overmilked by a minute and a half, I think she just wants to turn around and slap you when the unit comes off.
And occasionally they do slap you in a way with their feet, or you'll see these cows dancing. A lot of the same behavioral stuff that you'd see in those biphasic cows when that milk stops, because it's just not comfortable. And what's the result? Well, Phil talked about a little bit about this, but this is a great picture showing, if you've got vacuum on those teats, You're going to see rings around the top. So you see on this front teat here, she's got a ring across the top there where that vacuum is caused that.
Nice.
And then
discoloration.
a little discoloration at the end of the teat. Look at these rear teats where they're actually turning purple because that unit's been on there too long. So you've got that high vacuum on the teat ends, and in the short term, again, you're looking at uncomfortable cows. They're dancing around, they're kicking off the milker, they're kicking you. We've got teat congestion. We start to see then eventually teat damage, that thickening of the wall, and eventually, these cows are going to be cows that are going to have longer milking times.
No,
as that physiology of the teat changes.
But go back, Stan.
Yep.
We're going to go back 2 slides. Sorry.
Yeah. Because it was supposed to come off when?
Yes.
Oh,
it's
about 3
longer
minutes.
milking time. So we have the unit staying on a minute and a half after she's done milking. Right. Therefore, she's standing in the parlor a minute and a half longer than she should be standing in the parlor. Therefore, it increased the length of time that side was in the parlor. And as long as it's not just her, when over 30% of the cows are like this, it increases each shift in the parlor. Yeah. Every time there's a side in the parlor, it's increased by a minute to 2 minutes because of over milking.
Right. So if you want to start talking about parlor throughput, over milking is definitely one of those things that says we can make some improvements here.
And not only so I think this comes later. I apologize. I'm getting ahead of myself.
You can jump forward.
All right. So it increases each side by a minute to 2 minutes. What does that do for the accumulation over the milking?
Right.
Let's say it's an 8-hour milking shift. Well, if each side was increased by a minute to 2 minutes, we may have increased that shift length by
an hour or two. And that's that could change not only can I get through 3 milkings in a day, but also how many cows can I actually milk?
Right.
And so in both cases, that's a dramatic change in your profitability on the farm.
And cows that are waiting to be milked are standing in the holding area longer. They're away from feed and water longer. So there's incredible implications to increasing the time that the cows are in the parlor.
Right. So what we observed, why this is happening, in some cases, maybe no automatic detachers. That's a big issue in Florida for the research farms that we had down there. But we also saw that on some farms up here. It may be a parlor transition that they're making, and just the old parlor doesn't have detachers in it. And that's a pretty, unfortunate guessing game for milkers to be, really keeping track of what's going on with each one of those cows. We can have detacher malfunctions and have those set too dry. We have observed in some cases employees overriding and saying, hey, I'm going to put those on manual. I know this is the heifer group. The milkers don't fit them as well. And I don't want that slurping to cause the unit to come off. I'm going to hit them on manual. And then reattaching units. So got a great example of this. This is a reattached unit. And by the way, look at 156. When that unit came off, because she kicked it off, she was done. And that's why, because she wasn't comfortable, she said, well, if they're not going to take it off, I'll help them out. And notice that, over a minute and a half later, the employee came along and put that milker unit back on and put it on manual and said, by golly, we're going to try to get a few more drops out of this cow.
And she didn't get any more milk because the vacuum is high, meaning the milk flow is low.
Right. So, the big thing with overmilking, where biphasic didn't change necessarily milking time, overmilking certainly does. And if we're milking, again, as Phil said, that adds up and could be, an hour or 2 per day. It's going to mean longer milking shifts, longer time in the holding pen, longer time on their feet. So it's more than just about milk production. We're talking about health effects on the cow's feet and legs, and eventually increasing the cost of the farm. So the key points with overmilking, we pointed our producers to a research that was done by Stewart, written up in the Journal of Dairy Science. And really the key strategy to use here is, again, making sure that we're addressing the procedures first. Do we have good procedures? Are we following them? Because anything that we do with equipment, we need to have a good solid baseline. And then if the settings are separate, we go to adjusting the delay settings first and then the milking rate settings last in that process. So, when we look at the analysis of milking, the point of our whole research and what we were sharing with producers was not to go out and say, hey, this particular employee is messing up, might need to move them on. It was really about identifying problems and working with the employees, with the farm managers to go ahead and correct those. And the Vaidya unit was what allowed us to do that. They were the translators to let us know what the cows were experiencing out there in the parlor, allowing us then to provide education to the producers. When we measure something with a unit like a Vaidya unit or whatever we put out in the parlor, that means that we can start to set goals. And as Phil said, boy, we want less than 10%. And there's herds that can do that. So we know it can happen. And then we can also say, okay, there's the goals. Are we meeting those goals? Are we making progress? And of course, we should regularly monitor then. We went back out on herds with our extension program in the summer and said, boy, if you want to make a change, you're willing to commit to that, we'll come back out and measure it again. And we found that herds can make change to both overmilking and their biphasics by following the recommendations that we provided to them.
Some dairy producers may say that they've not experienced these problems. Well, unless you measure, you may not know that you experience these problems. That doesn't mean your cows have not experienced the problems. Just because you don't see it doesn't mean they don't experience it. One of the things that I do is, I tell you the truth, in a rotary parlor, it's the greatest place to look for this, because you position yourself about 15 seconds after the unit is attached and look for milk flow in the claw. But you can do that in any parlor. Watch the claws after attachment and see how many times milk flow stops. That gives you an indication if biphasic milkings occur, when you can see the milk flow in the claw. And then examine the teats when units come off. Look for discoloration. Look for rings. Look for things that indicate that, we've just been applying vacuum to a teat that hasn't been putting out any milk, and that has an impact on it. Milk a few cows out by hand after the units come off to find out how much milk is left in those cows. If it's too little, then we're over milking those cows. We need to make sure that we've adjusted things so that the experience of the cows is good, and so that the overall experience of the farm is good. For those who are working with farmers, and we know that on the webinar today and viewing it later, maybe some veterinarians, some equipment people, maybe some consultants, in other words, be flexible working with farms. You're going to have to go at milking times, and maybe you're going to need to go for a night milking as well as a day milking. Come up with a baseline of what's normal before you start making changes on that farm. Start working with one or two herds that you have good relationships with, so you can understand how things work, so that you can get a better feel for it, you can get comfortable with it before you expand out to other farms. Because we know these units are out there, they're available, they're relatively inexpensive units to be able to use in consulting work, and build a trusting relationship with producers and employees where everyone has the same goal: healthy cows producing healthy product. True efficiency is achieved when people and equipment work with the cow. So reduce non-milking time that the unit is on the cow by better stimulation and by removal of the unit when the cow is milked out. And the impact will be seen in the bulk tank and in cow udder health and productivity. We appreciate the time to spend with you today talking about this. We are ready to hear your questions and to find out what you know about this as well.
To Abby for some of her comments before we get to the Q&A. And we have lots of questions here, guys, so get ready, and we'll be off and running. Plus, we have some questions that we're sending before the webinar started. So, Abby, we'll let you kind of start winding down the summary.
Very good. Thank you, Stan and Phil. You did a great job tag teaming that and sharing that information. Every farm out there, dairy cows are milked every day, multiple times per day, and if there's something that can be improved, whether it's a small tweak or a major fix in the milking process, I think you shared a couple of great examples of what people could be looking for to improve their milking process. Thank you to everyone who's listening today. I just want to point out a couple of features if you are listening to our live presentation. One, if you look at the GoToWebinar control panel, there is a handout section. So if you would like any of these handouts to keep for future reference, You can print out those PDFs of the slides during the live webinar here. Also, if you have questions, there is a questions section where you can type in any questions that you would like our presenters to answer. As Mike mentioned, we have quite a few questions already in, and we would welcome a few more if anyone has something they'd like to ask. Also, all of our webinars that we've been doing since we started this project in 2011 are archived. So if you would like to listen to Stan and Phil give this presentation again, or share it with someone else, or look at some of our past webinars, please visit our website, www.hordes.com, and look for the webinar tab. You also get a survey in your email, and that will ask you a few questions about the presentation, just giving us some feedback for planning future webinars. Speaking of future webinars, I want you to look at the screen here, and you will see our next two webinars. They always take place on the second Monday of every month at noon Central Time. On May 13th, we will have our very own Mike Hutchins from the University of Illinois presenting, and his topic seminar will be titled Focusing on Fresh Cow Strategies. We have a sponsor there of Zinpro Performance Minerals. We appreciate their support of that webinar. Then, looking ahead to June and hopefully summer weather, we'll have a presentation by Joe Dalton from the University of Idaho, and he'll be talking about synchronization strategies for heifers. So talking about the reproduction of the young stock, the younger animals on the farm. So please, we hope you'll make plans to attend one or both of those webinars when they get closer. Then we did have a few questions that came in ahead of time. So one of them is written here. I will let Mike go through that, and then we will let Phil and Stan take a stab at answering it.
Well, very good. Here's one question that came in from before the webinar started, and I think everybody can read that pretty quickly there as far as that goes. The average milking time per cow on our farm is almost 6 minutes. With three times a day milking, we try to change our protocol to shorten that milking time, but it has no influence. Our milk protocol is stripping, pre-dipping 4 cows, then wiping 4 cows, and attaching 4 cows. It takes 70 seconds from touching the first cow to putting the milker on. How can I speed up the milking time? Off and running, gentlemen.
All right.
Well, we have some questions. We don't fully understand the situation. We don't know how large the parlor is. That is, how many cows to a side of the parlor. That might affect our protocol choice. And then we're not sure about the 6 minutes of milking, whether that's the time from when the cow is on the platform, or whether that's the time the unit goes on to the unit comes off. If in fact it's time the unit goes on, the unit comes off, that is a long time.
That's pretty long.
Typically our milking times are 4 to 5 minutes,
Right.
and cow is milked out in that time, especially with 3x milking, and we assume she's a high production cow. But even so, we would expect that if a milking unit was on 6 minutes, that could be a long milking. Now, obviously, I think I would check for over milking. I would want to check the detached, the automatic detacher settings, and see if that animals are being over milked. We could do that. You could do that by hand milking the cow and seeing how much milk is left in the cow when the unit comes off. And then, of course, you give us your protocol, and you take us through the protocol. That's where I want to know how many cows are on a side, because 4 cows, I commend you for breaking it up to a manageable number of cows. I'd also want to know how many people were in the parlor. We could stretch that 4 to 6. I've seen 7 cows sometimes. Obviously, depending on the numbers in the parlor, how many cows we work with at one time. I'd also want to make sure that we're not experiencing the biphasic milking by saying, are we getting enough stimulation up front? Because the 70 seconds from first touch is sufficient,
Right.
if we have, in the first visit to the cow, sufficient stimulation to get the milk let down by that 70 seconds.
Right. Yeah, I think over milking would be obviously a good place to look first, and then I'd certainly look at that biphasic. That 70 seconds needs to be after high quality stimulation.
Right.
And so a little more detail on that, but there's certainly opportunities to look at that. And we're certainly, on any of these questions too, we're more than happy to field these questions by email or phone call. You've got our contact information, so don't hesitate to follow up with us.
Maybe the rest of you know the answers and we don't, which is fine, because that applies to this next question.
This next question is a little bit tougher.
Yeah.
Because there's, you know, the answer is, you know, how does it affect milking? It does. And, you know, it really depends. What you're really looking for is a good fit on that cow. And so we did see in on farms some cases where the observation would indicate that there probably wasn't a really good fit on those cows. And you'll get some really strange Vaidya graphs when that happens, because the vacuum never really drops down at the teat end if there's not a good fit there. So I'd really encourage the person to work with their milking equipment provider, try out some different inflations and find out what works for their cows. Obviously, heifers have smaller teats than older cows, and so we'll see in some cases more fit issues with those first lactation animals when they come through as well.
But I don't think the first response to a problem is to change inflations, because if it's a protocol problem, if it's a setting problem for detachers, that's not going to be solved by inflation.
Right.
And we have to make sure we solve the right problem.
Right. So if you've got access to, go ahead.
Yeah, a question came in very quickly. What do you mean by good fit? You said the inflation is a good fit. Does that mean part of the teat goes into the inflation, or the total teat goes in? What do you mean by good fit?
Well, you know, when the pulsation is going back and forth, you need a good closure at the end of that teat to allow it to not have vacuum at part of that milking process, the pulsation process. If you don't have a good fit, you'll end up having vacuum at the teat end continuously. And that's not good for the health of the cow or for milk flow if that's never gets that relief in that pulsation cycle. And so that's the biggest thing, Mike. And then, of course, obviously, if you've got the slurping going on or vacuum being introduced around the teat, that would be the other extreme.
Well, let's switch to another topic. What about robotics? Have you done any comparisons on robotics in terms of stimulation and overmilking in those type of units? We had several questions that I think you can wrap up in answering in terms of proper stimulation and terms of biphasic and overmilking.
Well, we only had, I think, one herd in our dairy team summer research project that did put the Vaidya units on some robots. And I think the short answer is they can provide adequate stimulation, but they are not a automatic answer to.
It's not a given, right?
It's not a given. So they have to follow this. I mean, the cow is still, either having a good experience or bad experience, whether a person or a robot is putting the milker unit on. So
I think that would apply to the automatic brushes that are used for cleaning cows as well too.
Right.
It's a matter of how much time is spent on each teat, as well as the pressure on the teat to give that stimulation. So whether it's a robot, which often in time it's a rotating brush, or whether it's a mechanical rotating brush that's used, again, the stimulation is critically important, and the time that's spent on those teats, because I've seen people use those automatic brush type things in very short time periods and go on, and that's just not enough stimulation.
Yeah, the stimulation provided by either the robot or the handheld stimulation, the cleaning units, is not magically better than what we can provide with our hand.
Right.
So they still need the 10 to 15 seconds. They still need the lag time in there to get that oxytocin release and milk let down.
We had another comment it's a comment, maybe you want to just say a word on it, and that is a herd in which was visited in which the milkers have numbers on their sleeves, and a number two milker cannot attach a unit until number one has reached the fifth or sixth cow down the line, and they call that an offensive play. What do you think of that strategy?
I think that's a great way to try to deal with that. I wrote an article about helpful employees and talked about, if you're coming into the parlor and you're interrupting a routine, you can't step into that zone of that milker unless that other employee steps out. And so kind of a handing of a baton would be the other way to handle it. But yeah, we really have to be careful that with multiple people in the parlor, that we're still following the protocol from beginning to end for each cow.
Many of our farms will actually use zones for employees so that they do all the visits to a cow, but I believe you're referring to where it's not zones, but rather, in fact, multiple employees are going to the same cow.
That is, I think you're correct. Well, let's, very good. Can overmilking or biphasic milking cause blood in the milk or bloody milk?
I would say minimal chance.
Yeah.
We're really talking about, we're really not talking about doing internal damage to the udder itself, rather a slow thickening of the cell walls and the teat itself, if you've got, vacuum on it for quite a while. So I think the short answer would be, it would be unlikely.
Okay. Can we measure stimulation of the udder by looking at the flow rate in the first 0 to 15 seconds or the percent milk in the first 2 minutes? And if the answer is yes, then what should those numbers be for both of those time periods, 0 to 15 and the first 2 minutes?
Well, 0 to 15 is a little short, because the cow will first milk out the milk that's in the cisterns that's there. So 0 to 15 is a little short in order to determine if the cow has been stimulated sufficiently. And the 0 to 2 minute.
Yeah, Dr. Erskine does have some pretty good data on that. I don't have it right at my fingertips, Dr. Erskine, but the key with both of those, depending on what flow rate measurement the farm has, if you're trying to figure out biphasics, you need to make sure that you've got a continuous flow rate measurement going on. We know that some of the units use more like a dump type measurement, and depending on the fraction of a couple of drops that it may take to trip that dump,
the rounding of that.
The rounding can cause some real issues with trying to figure out what's happening with biphasic.
So although they measure the total milk output very well, the incremental milk output in a 2 minute time period may not be very accurate because of the sequence of dump and measure, and the rounding that occurs in those things.
Now, this question, I think, ties right into this one. Let me ask you that. And it said, what should that percent time in low freight be in seconds? And it sounds like you're saying 15 is too short. What is there a time that you could use to answer that question, a low flow rate initially? Or have I just confused you?
No, just don't have the quick answer right at the tip of my tongue on that, Dr. Erskine. So there is some things that we can do to look at, what's happening with that experience with the cow with the flow rate measurements. But I don't have that number right at the top of my, frankly, we're continuing to learn about what's happening out there. So I know that the milking equipment manufacturers have some recommendations for flow rate.
But whether that's good enough is a question mark. And it really is a question mark still. I think that what we've learned in some of these studies is that, frankly, it's not accurate enough for telling about biphasic milking in the first 2 minutes.
Well, then we got a couple of questions that go back to the equipment as far as that goes. How can we determine delay time on farms if we don't have your sophisticated equipment there? What should we be looking for when we go in the parlor this afternoon or tomorrow?
Well, I think that in a rough way that you can take a look, if you have a claw that you can see through, and watch what happens after the milk flow starts. And watch it for a couple minutes after milk flow starts, and do that continually through the parlor. Your milkers really can't stop and watch. Probably that's the case. So somebody else has to do the watching if you're going to determine whether or not the stimulation has occurred. Because when we can see milk flow start and then stop, we know that we have biphasic milking. And then just keep a tally sheet and say, okay, there's one. And then evaluate over how many milkings you saw that. That gives you an idea of how many milkings in that session were biphasic. And you can do the percentages and say, well, it was less than 10% or it was over 30%, whatever the case is. And again, we're shooting for a goal of 10% or less on biphasic milking.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the equipment really isn't, I mean, to the point of the company, it's very nice equipment, but it's not an expensive equipment. It's not something we believe every farm should have. Right. But we think that there's a number of people out there with it, and we know there's a number of people out there with it, and it may be helpful to find a dealer or a veterinarian with the equipment that can help evaluate that further. Yeah, we have a number of veterinarians in Michigan that have them, and then we have a number of units ourselves out in the field that we can do some analysis with on farms. But Phil's right on that. With all the fancy equipment, obviously the nice part of that is you can observe other things, as we mentioned earlier, as that data is being collected, and you can collect more data. But you still have a set of eyes. You can still go out there. Remember that biphasic is, by definition, they let milk down and then they stop, and so you get that initial harvest out of the teat in the gland cistern. Then milk flow stops, and then it starts back up again. So you can observe that in a clear claw very easily. Once you get looking for it, you'd be surprised at how many you might find, and you can keep a record of that and say, okay, I have this many percent out of the cows that I saw. And then again, on overmilking, you can manually, when those units come off, you can strip out those 4 quarters. The gold standard is to have between a half a cup and a cup that you would get out of those. So if it's more than that, then the milking unit should have stayed on longer. If it's less than that, then you've overmilked the cow. So I can tell you from experience that cows aren't real excited to have you do that right after the unit comes off. But it is still the gold standard. It is still a great way to determine if overmilking is a problem in your herd.
Okay, another question says, how much milk loss can be expected when a cow is overmilked? And then they've got some additional comments. You can be thinking about that. We have an AFI system on our farm and the ability to measure flow and routine. And what about guidelines in terms of, I think you've already answered the 2-minute and the low flow rate. We've answered that. So what about the overmilking?
Well, we don't believe the overmilking results in any lower milk production. Okay, where we lose milk production with overmilking is because cows are spending more time in the holding area. Cows are spending more time on their feet, and it's an eventual loss. So overmilking is frankly not going to reduce the milk harvest per cow at the time of milking.
Right.
Biphasic will reduce the milk harvest of the cow at the time of milking. Overmilking will not do that. Overmilking will result in a longer milking session. And that will have impacts on the herd.
Cow health, and eventually, you may end up with a cow that milks so slow because you've overmilked her, too much, that eventually you end up culling that cow earlier. But certainly no immediate effects on milk production.
Another question is a case study, and that is, I think I even know the answer. But anyway, on my farm, with a 0 to 15 second flow rate is less than a pound, but the percent in the first 2 minutes is 37 to 39%. Is that okay, or do I need to make some changes in that in the 0 to 15 second flow rate by udder preparation?
Oh, I would say yes. If the unit goes on and you get less than a pound in 15 seconds, then I don't think that preparation has been sufficient. I think that the stimulation has not been there, and the udder was not ready when the unit went on. Frankly, that's a low amount for even being in the teat cisterns. So I think that we need to concentrate there on stimulation of those teats, and then check your lag time between that stimulation, which is defective, and the attachment of the unit.
Right.
How much variation is acceptable in dairy production? And this is a very large herd in a foreign country here. What is acceptable? Variation, perhaps that would be expressed as pounds per cow per day or kilo per cow per day in his case here, from a day-to-day basis.
Oh boy.
I'm sorry, variation in the production of the cows?
Yeah, the production of the cows, or in the Vaidya, or in the
I think it's production in the cow. The production, how much variation is acceptable in daily production? They have 40 tons of production.
From one day to the next day. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Boy, I like to see cows being fairly consistent, because the more consistency you have day to day in individual animals, then the greater ability to determine when an animal is is off for some reason, when she is not feeling well, when she's or in heat, when something that changes the consistency says I have a problem now. If I have inconsistency, it's much more difficult to determine when I have a problem with that cow. Inconsistency can come about maybe by inconsistency in feed availability, inconsistency in milking times, inconsistency in other things. But I would look for a day-to-day consistency between cows of less than 5 pounds of milk.
How do you answer the question of a farmer who, this is in the Midwest, by the way, who has basically a double 50? So he'd have to have 100 detachers. And he said, there's no way I can keep 100 detachers working properly 24/7. Comments on that?
So instead of 100 detachers, he's got
None.
6 detachers in the parlor, 6 manual detachers in the parlor, or 8 manual detachers in the parlor, or something like that. And then the question is, how consistent are they going to be? You know, the problem is in a large parlor like that, people you can't see the cow, you can't see 3 cows down very well. You can't see what's happening, and to have your milkers, to have that burden be on your milkers of determining when a cow is done requires a high level of skill that is difficult to achieve, and consistency in that is very difficult to achieve. You'll be much more consistent, frankly, with automatic detachers than you are with the people in the parlor. And we put a lot of emphasis on training employees. We put a lot of emphasis on developing employees, but that's a high call for any employee to be able to consistently determine when cows are done milking.
The last question is actually my question, and that is, what is the cost of your Vaidya unit? Could a large farmer afford to have one so he can periodically check various units on the farm? And how many cows do I have to check to determine if I'm using your unit?
Well, I think that's the place to start with that last question, how many cows to check. And I think that the checking 30 cows is probably a minimum. So for instance, if you've got 10 sides in the parlor and you've got 4 units in the parlor, then you're going to get 40 cows. Okay, that is so if you have 2 units on one side, 2 units on the other side, and we, by the way, try to do those as a first cow and a last cow, just to see if there's any differences between those animals. And so I would think that if you can do at least 30 cows during a milking, you'll have good numbers to work with and say what your percentages are.
Yeah, so when you're looking at the cost, as far as the units go, there's a price per unit, and then there's also a price per license or whatever. But basically, the units cost about $1,000 a piece. To purchase those, and the license runs around a couple $1,000s as well, or $1,000 a piece for the licenses as well. So just give you a ballpark. I mean, obviously, then you have to have a way to manage the data, but most farms have a laptop or a computer that's got sufficient.
So if I wanted 3 units and the licenses to do that, any kind of supplies and maintenance, give me a total number there.
Yeah, if you were looking at, well, I'll give you 4 because that's what I have in my mind. But
if I wanted 4 units, that's an even number.
You're looking at about $6,000-7,000 to do that, and to basically buy a technology that's going to be able to be used for, if you're buying on the individual farm. Now, for in most cases, this is something that a veterinarian could, maybe an area veterinarian could be encouraged to purchase and come out and work with you. But if you wanted to have your own, that would certainly be an option.
So you would say $6,000 to $7,000 for that.
Yep.
Okay.
Fantastic. Here's the last question. I promise. I think it's the last question. What should be the time between the last detach to the first attach in efficient milking routine? So I'm guessing this is loading the parlor, or I'll let you guys. That's how I read it.
Parlor, yeah. I see parlors that are run very efficiently as far as the loading and unloading. Obviously, when we talk about unloading, we're going to talk about rapid exits. But the problem is that in the length of a parlor, when animals are coming down that length, you're waiting on those animals. I know that really the first cow should be starting to be prepped even as the second cow is getting in position, and don't wait for all those animals to get in position before you start that process. We can start the process once that first cow is in position, and then move down as the other cows get in position, so that it reduces the time as cows are loading. But it would be hard to come up with a time just because of the differences in size of parlors.
Yeah, I agree.
Great answer, guys. Listen, several good comments, like great seminar, good webinar. And I know after losing that basketball game, you need all that confidence you can get. So, Abby, we'll turn it back to you to wind up the webinar.
One last basketball jab for Mike. But no, thank you, Stan and Phil. Great job. Lots of good information in that presentation. And it's always a pleasure for us to have people like yourselves who are working with dairy farmers and doing research to help improve dairy farms around the country and around the world. So we thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. We had a nice large audience in attendance again today. We thank all of you for being part of the webinar, for listening to the presentation. We really strive to provide information that we hope appeals to a wide variety of people, whether you're milking cows or working with dairy farmers. And it's great to have so many of you join us today. Please remember, our future webinars are coming up in May. On the 13th, we will be focusing on fresh cow strategies with Dr. Hutchins. And then in June, on the 10th, we will have Joe Dalton, a new webinar presenter for us, talking about synchronization strategies for heifers. So please mark your calendar for these two events. And then until next time, I'd like to say farewell to all of you out in the audience. From us here at Hoard's Dairyman and the University of Illinois, it's always a pleasure to get together and do these webinar projects with all of you in attendance. So have a great day.